Emma had been running for 6 days, which was 5 days longer than her body had any right to allow, and roughly 6 days longer than her dignity could survive. Her feet were raw. Her tunic was a wet rag plastered to ribs she could count, and she was running, voluntarily, with full knowledge of where she was headed, toward the one place in the known world where everything with a pulse was considered a beverage. She was, by any reasonable assessment, an idiot. But the alternative was dying in the mud behind her, torn apart by wolves who used to forget to save her a seat at the fire, and who had recently graduated to forgetting she deserved to breathe. So, vampires. Vampires it was. At least they'd be direct about it. The black citadel materialized out of the storm like a hallucination, obsidian spires clawing at a bruised sky, the whole structure looking less like architecture and more like the earth had grown teeth. The great stone steps leading to the gates were slick with rain, and Emma's legs buckled on the third one. She crawled the rest, her palms scraping raw on unforgiving rock, which was, she reflected with the grim clarity of a woman who had absolutely nothing left, a fitting way to arrive at the doorstep of the damned. On her knees. The gates were wrought iron twisted into thorns and sleeping nightbirds. No bell, no knocker. Just the wind shrieking its indifference through the crenellations above. She pressed her forehead against the cold metal, and the word came out before she could stop it, before she could coat it in anything that might protect her from the pathetic smallness of it. Please. She expected nothing. She expected to freeze here, a forgotten footnote at the threshold of a nightmare. Instead, the gates groaned inward with the slow, grinding patience of something that had been waiting for centuries, and could wait for centuries more. Beyond them, a courtyard paved in marble so black it drank the rain. Soft, sourceless light. And two figures, tall and still as statuary, their faces pale masks of aristocratic boredom, their eyes the color of dried blood. They wore the high-collared livery of royal guards, and they did not blink as she staggered past them, dripping, shaking, leaving a trail of mud on their perfect floor. The gates sealed behind her. The storm vanished, not faded, not muffled, vanished, as if someone had turned off the world. Well, Emma whispered to no one, that's not terrifying at all. They led her through halls that made her feel like a stain on a wedding dress. Portraits of pale, stern-faced beings watched her pass, with painted eyes that felt uncomfortably physical. The ceilings disappeared into shadow. The floors were polished to mirrors. And there was no scent. That was the part that nearly broke her. Emma's world had always been built on scent. Even with hers broken, even with the hollow nothing where her own pack scent should have been, she could still read the world through her nose. Pine resin, damp earth, the sharp citrus of someone's anxiety, the warm yeast of a pack-house kitchen. Here there was nothing. The air was thin and cold and utterly sterile, like breathing inside a crystal. It was like going deaf and blind at once. Her wolf senses, starved of input, did the only thing they could. They screamed. She swallowed it. Filed the panic under later, along with everything else she couldn't afford to feel right now. The list was getting long. The throne room doors opened without sound, petrified wood, polished to the sheen of dark water. The chamber beyond was a cavern of shadow and hard starlight. The ceiling was an enchanted dome, a replica of the night sky where the stars didn't twinkle, but blazed with a cold, unwavering intensity. The floor was obsidian mirror, and with every step, Emma watched her own reflection rise to meet her, mud-streaked, half-starved, barefoot. She looked, she thought with detached honesty, like something a river had spat out. And on a throne carved from a single piece of crystalline quartz sat the king. He was not the snarling monster of the stories. He was stillness, simple black clothes that seemed to drink light, hair like raven feathers against skin that was not pale, but luminous, the white of fine porcelain held up to a candle. Features so perfectly angular they crossed the line from beautiful into something that made the animal part of her brain want to bolt. And his eyes, a deep, impossible violet, held the weight of centuries. Not the romantic weight of old songs, the crushing weight of a man who had been awake for 1,000 years, and could not close his eyes. He did not move as she approached, her reflection distorted beneath her on the mirror floor, a warped ghost keeping pace. She stopped at the foot of the dais. She didn't know how to address a king. She definitely didn't know how to address a vampire king while looking like a drowned rat with a death wish. So she went with honesty, because it was the only currency she had left. "Your Majesty, I've come to beg for sanctuary." Her voice was raw, cracked at the edges, which I realize is a bit like a chicken asking to sleep in the fox's den. But I'm out of options, and I'm told you appreciate directness. She was not, in fact, told anything of the sort, but if she was going to die, she'd rather do it with a complete sentence than a whimper. The silence stretched. It pressed against her eardrums. She lifted her head a fraction and met his eyes. "A wolf," he said. His voice was a low baritone, quiet as velvet, and it filled the entire hall without effort. "A lost lamb, bleeding at the door of the slaughterhouse." A pause. "Why should I grant you sanctuary? Your kind and mine have been at war since the moon first kissed the sea." "My kind cast me out," she said, and there it was, the shame, hot and immediate, a wound she hadn't managed to scar over. "I have no pack, no alpha. They'll kill me if they find me. I'd rather take my chances with the foxes." "And we will kill you when we grow bored of you," he replied. Not a threat, a fact, stated with the casual precision of someone reading a weather report. "What use is a single broken wolf to me?" The word broken hit like a backhand. He knew, of course he knew. He could probably sense the void where her scent should be, the gap in the frequency, the nothing. Emma held his gaze. Her eyes burned, but she would not cry in front of this creature. "I can work," she said. "I can scrub your very dramatic floors. I can serve. And I'm told I'm excellent company at parties on account of no one ever notices I'm there." The words came out with a sharpness she hadn't planned, a blade of self-deprecation that she used before anyone else could use the truth against her. "I just want to live. That's the whole pitch." King Cassian leaned forward. His violet eyes narrowed, and something unreadable moved through them. Not pity, not amusement. Something closer to recognition. He was silent for so long that Emma became convinced this was how vampires said no. They just waited until you died of old age. Then the corner of his mouth moved. The left side. It was not a smile of warmth. It was the expression of a man who had just found the answer to a question no one knew he'd been asking. "Very well," he said. "Sanctuary is granted." The relief hit her like a wall of water. She swayed, bit down hard on the inside of her cheek to keep from making a sound. She had her life. But as she looked up at that beautiful, terrible face, at that knowing half-smile, a needle of cold certainty slid between her ribs. He had said yes too easily. Whatever she was to him, it wasn't a scrubbing girl with a mop. She'd find out what it was. But she had a sinking feeling that by the time she did, it would be far too late to renegotiate. The chambers they gave her were obscene. Not a cell, a suite of rooms high in one of the spires, with a stone balcony overlooking a 1,000-foot drop. Silk sheets, a fire burning with strange blue flame that gave off no smoke. Clothes in her size, dark wool gowns, linen shifts, leather slippers that made her raw feet want to weep with gratitude. The vampire servant who showed her in was an older female named Marin, silver-haired, granite-eyed, with the economy of movement that suggested she had been doing this exact job since before Emma's grandparents were born. "You are not to leave these chambers without permission," Marin said, her voice like rustling parchment. "Food and water will be brought. The king will summon you when he has need of you." "Need of me for what?" Emma asked. Marin looked at her the way one might look at a puppy who'd asked about astrophysics. "The king's needs are his own." And then she was gone, dissolving into the corridor shadows as if she'd never existed. Emma stood in the center of the vast bedroom, alone and warm for the first time in 6 days, and said aloud to the empty room, "Cool. Love the communication style. Very healthy." For 3 days she saw no one but Marin, who appeared twice daily with trays of wolf's fare. Thick bread, smoked meats, cheese, clean water. The food was a comfort and a deep source of unease. They knew what she was. They knew what she needed. She was being kept, and kept well. The silence was the worst of it. In the pack there was always sound. Breathing, wind, the murmur of voices, the distant crack of a branch underfoot. Here, silence was a physical thing, a presence with mass and texture. It pressed against her until she felt her edges dissolving into it. On the second night, she couldn't bear it anymore. She stepped onto the narrow stone balcony, into the thin mountain air and the howling wind, and she let the shift take her. It hurt. It always hurt, no matter what anyone said. Bones reshaping, muscles unknitting and reknitting. A fire that started in her sternum and radiated outward until her whole body was a white-hot line of pain. And then it broke, and she was through, and the world snapped into focus with a clarity that made her human senses feel like looking through frosted glass. She stood on the balcony in wolf form, gray-furred and lean from the days of running, the wind cutting through her coat and carrying nothing. No scent. Even as a wolf, in a form built for reading the world through her nose, the citadel gave her nothing. Stone, cold, air so clean it was empty. But her body was hers again. The four-legged weight of herself, the coiled strength in her haunches, the way her claws gripped the stone. She sat on that balcony and stared out at the endless sea of clouds below, and for 10 minutes, she was not a guest, or a prisoner, or a tool. She was just a wolf, sitting very high up, in a place that smelled like absolutely nothing, which was at least consistent with the rest of her life. She shifted back in the cold, the transition leaving her gasping and naked on the stone for a few disoriented seconds before she scrambled inside and wrapped herself in blankets. The shift had cost her. She was weaker than she'd realized, but it had given her something back, too. A reminder of what she was, underneath the nothing. She didn't know that Cassian 2 floors below had felt it. A ripple in the vast, screaming, psychic ocean of his awareness. Not a voice, not a song, but a sudden, startling pocket of warmth, like a match struck in an endless dark room. He had stopped mid-sentence in whatever he was reading, his hand frozen over the page, and turned his face toward the ceiling. The summons came on the evening of the 3rd day. Marin appeared at her door with a lantern. "The king requires your presence." Emma smoothed down the dark green wool of her gown, noted that her hands were trembling, and followed. They didn't go to the throne room. They went to a different wing, to a pair of oak doors bound in iron. Marin gestured. Emma hesitated, then pushed the door open. A library. Vast, circular. Walls lined floor to ceiling with more books than she'd seen in her life. A rolling ladder disappearing into shadow. A circular table heaped with maps and celestial charts. Blue fire in a massive hearth. And the smell, the first real smell she'd encountered in this place, of old paper, leather, and something clean and cold, like the air before snow. Cassian stood by the fire, his back to her, wearing dark burgundy instead of black. He looked less like a monarch and more like a man who read too much and slept too little. He did not turn. "Come closer," he said. She obeyed, stopping a few feet behind him. He stared into the flames with the focused intensity of someone trying to solve a problem the fire wasn't cooperating with. "Are you recovering?" he asked. "Yes, Your Majesty, thank you." "There is no need for thanks." A strange, dry note. "You are here for a purpose." "I've been told," repeatedly, by everyone except the person who could actually explain what it is. He turned. In the firelight, the sharp architecture of his face softened into something almost approachable, and his violet eyes caught the flame and burned. He studied her, and she had the disquieting sensation of being read like one of his manuscripts. "Your pack cast you out because of your scent," he said. or rather, your lack of one. You are a null, a void. A flaw, she said flatly. A curse? A factory defect? Pick your metaphor, I've heard them all. A flaw, he mused, and took a slow step toward her. She braced for a blow, a bite, whatever came next, but he stopped, just out of arm's reach, and tilted his head. Perhaps. Or perhaps it is a unique and valuable quality. All depends on one's perspective. In my experience, the perspective of the person calling you a void doesn't tend to improve the situation. Something flickered in his expression. Not quite amusement, but an acknowledgement that she had said something he hadn't expected. He was, she realized, accustomed to people who spoke to him in the careful, hollow language of fear. Her sharp honesty was a novelty. She wasn't sure if that was good or dangerous. He raised a hand. She flinched, squeezed her eyes shut. But nothing came. She felt only the subtle displacement of air as his fingers hovered near her face. Close enough to feel, not close enough to touch. She opened her eyes. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the space between his hand and her skin, as if reading something written there in invisible ink. Then he closed his eyes and inhaled. Slowly, deeply, the way someone might breathe after being under water for too long. A shudder ran through him. The taut lines around his eyes smoothed, the coiled tension in his shoulders unwound by a degree that was visible. For one moment, just one, the ancient, crushing weariness that clung to him lifted, and what was underneath was not a monster or a king, but a man experiencing something that felt like relief. He opened his eyes. They met hers, and she saw it, raw, aching, desperate. He needed this. He needed her. Not her skills, not her service. The nothing that she was. Remarkable, he breathed. He lowered his hand. The mask slid back into place. But Emma had seen what was underneath, and she was not the kind of person who could unsee things. "You're not going to tell me what just happened, are you?" she said. "Not tonight." He turned back to the fire. "You may go." She backed toward the door. Her heart was hammering. He had not hurt her. He had not fed from her. He had simply stood near her and become, briefly, a different person. She was not a guest. She was a resource. She just didn't know what kind yet. The weeks settled into a pattern that was, depending on how Emma chose to look at it, either comfortable or profoundly disturbing. She was given the freedom of the citadel, conditional, observed, but real. She could walk the corridors, explore the forgotten wings, discover the glass gardens where pale, scentless flowers bloomed in eternal twilight. The other vampires watched her with a mixture of contempt and wary curiosity. She was the wolf pet, the king's new acquisition, and her presence had disrupted something in the stagnant, unchanging ecosystem of the court. Lord Ashworth was the worst of them, an ancient, sharp-boned vampire with eyes like polished obsidian and a smile that never reached them. He'd served as advisor to the throne for generations, and he watched Emma with the focused patience of someone choosing where to place a knife. He cornered her once, in one of the forgotten corridors near the glass gardens. She'd been walking back from an afternoon session with Cassian, her mind still half in a conversation about title charts, when his voice stopped her cold. "You are aware," Lord Ashworth said, materializing from a shadow she hadn't known contained him, "that the last mortal who held the king's attention was drained within a year. Not out of malice, simply because the court grew tired of accommodating a heartbeat." Emma turned. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, perfectly composed, the picture of a concerned elder statesman delivering friendly counsel. "Is that a threat?" she asked. "It is a history lesson. I am a great believer in the instructive power of history." His obsidian eyes held hers. "You have no scent. That makes you difficult to read. I find that unsettling. Most people find it convenient. They don't have to think about me at all. I am not most people, and I am thinking about you a great deal." He inclined his head, courteous, lethal, and walked away. Emma stood in the corridor and catalogued her own heartbeat, rapid, steady enough. She filed the encounter under Ashworth, subcategory Direct Warning, and added it to the mental map she'd been building of the court's power lines since her second week. Almost every day Cassian summoned her. The pattern was always the same. She would sit in a chair near his desk while he worked, and over the course of hours the tension would drain from him like water from a cracked vessel. His breathing would deepen. The muscle in his jaw would unclench. She was a tonic, a balm, a walking silence that soothed some unseen, unheard agony. But each session was different, because Emma was not the kind of person who could sit quietly in a room and not have opinions about it. "You have 700 years of correspondence with someone named Aldrich," she observed one afternoon, eyeing a shelf of bound letters. "Either that's a very slow pen pal or a very long grudge." "Both," Cassian said, without looking up from his work. And then, so quietly she almost missed it, "He owed me a horse." She stared at him. He did not elaborate. She filed it away as evidence that Cassian might, against all available data, have a sense of humor buried somewhere under 1,000 years of performance. On another afternoon, while he annotated a legal document with a focus that suggested the fate of empires rested on its margins, she asked, "Do you eat?" "Not in the way you mean." That wasn't an answer. He set down his pen. "Blood, infrequently. I am old enough to require very little. It is more maintenance than sustenance." "Where do you get it?" "Willing donors among the court. It is a formal arrangement, ancient and consensual." "Is this the conversation you wish to be having?" "I'm having it, aren't I? I'd rather know the rules of the house I'm living in than guess at them and be wrong." He studied her. Then, with the careful precision of a man unaccustomed to being asked direct questions about himself, he answered. She listened. She asked follow-up questions. He answered those too, looking increasingly like someone who had opened a door he hadn't meant to open and was now too committed to close it. By the third week, the library had begun to develop a scent, not the sterile nothing of the rest of the Citadel, something specific. Old paper and leather had always been there, but now Emma was catching something else underneath. Cold stone, a trace of something herbal and astringent, and beneath that, fainter still, a note like winter air just before snowfall. Clean, austere, not warm. Nothing about Cassian was warm, but distinct. It was him. She was learning to smell him, and the realization sat in her chest like a coal. Wolves knew each other by scent. It was how pack bonds formed, slowly, through proximity, through the body learning another body's chemical signature until the absence of it felt wrong. Emma had never bonded to anyone. Her null scent meant no one bonded to her, and she'd assumed the reverse was also true. She'd assumed wrong. She didn't mention it. She filed it under dangerous, along with the book, the flower, and the fact that she'd started listening for his footsteps in the corridor before he arrived. He asked her strange questions. Not about the pack, about the minutiae of the living world. What did the air smell like after summer rain? What was the texture of moss on a fallen log? What sound did autumn leaves make underfoot? He listened to her descriptions with an intensity that bordered on hunger. He was a man starving for a world he could not taste. "You can't feel the fire," she said one evening, watching him stand before the hearth. "I perceive its light and its movement. The warmth is an abstraction." That's the saddest thing anyone has ever said to me. And I once heard an alpha tell a 6-year-old she smelled wrong. He looked at her sharply. "That was said to you?" "It was said to me," she confirmed, keeping her voice level, using the truth like a shield the way she always did. Saying it first, saying it flat, so no one else got to make it hurt. "I was 6. I stopped crying about it when I was 8. Efficient learner." Something changed in his face. Not pity. She would have hated pity. Something more precise. An acknowledgement that the fact she had just stated was not acceptable, filed away with the same meticulous care he gave to everything. That night, a book appeared on her bedside table. A collection of fairy tales, old ones, with illustrations. She opened it and found, pressed between the pages like a bookmark, a single dried flower, one of the scentless silver roses from the glass garden. It was a gesture so small and so deliberate that it took her a full minute to understand what it was. It was care, expressed sideways, by a man who would die before admitting it. She put the flower back between the pages and did not mention it, but she kept the book on her nightstand, and they both knew it. It was a few days after the flower that the library became a problem. She was in the chair, her chair, though she hadn't claimed it yet in words, when Cassian stood to retrieve a volume from a high shelf behind her. He reached over her, his arm passing close enough that the sleeve of his tunic brushed her hair, and the cold that radiated from his skin, always, that persistent bone-deep cold, fell across the side of her neck like a shadow. She went very still. He went very still. His hand was on the book. He hadn't pulled it from the shelf. He was close enough that she could see the texture of his skin, the faint blue veins at his wrist, the way his fingers had locked around the spine of the volume and were not moving. His face was turned slightly toward her, and she could feel his attention, not his psychic sense, just his awareness, fixed on the place where his sleeve had touched her hair. She was warm. She ran warm. All wolves did. But right now her skin felt like it was generating its own small furnace, and the proximity of his cold was doing something to the air between them. The temperature gradient was a physical thing, a border her body wanted to cross. She did not look up. If she looked up, his face would be very close, and she would have to make a decision about what to do with that information, and she was not ready to make that decision, and her heart was doing something inconvenient and loud. He pulled the book from the shelf, stepped back. The cold withdrew. "Tidal displacement in the northern straits," he said, his voice perfectly steady in a way that was, itself, a tell. "If you're interested." "Riveting," she managed. Her voice was also steady, which she considered a personal triumph. He returned to his desk. She returned to her book. Neither of them mentioned it. But something had changed in the geometry of the room. The distance between their chairs, 4 feet, she'd measured it with her eyes in the first week, had become an active choice, not a passive one. Every time she sat down, she was choosing not to be closer. Every time he pulled a book from a shelf, he was choosing where to reach. The space between them hummed with the specific, charged silence of something being very carefully not discussed. A week later, she was reading by the fire when he came to add a log. He knelt by the hearth. She'd told him once that it was strange to watch someone tend a fire they couldn't feel, and he'd said, "I can feel you feeling it," which is close enough, in a tone so matter-of-fact that she'd had to leave the room to process it. And as he rose, his hand landed on the armrest of her chair for balance. His fingers were inches from hers. The cool of his skin was a whisper against the warmth of her wrist. Neither of them moved. She could hear his breathing. It was slower than hers, deeper, a rhythm calibrated over centuries. And she could smell him, that winter air note, sharper now, threaded with something she could only describe as a tension. He was aware of her hand the way a compass is aware of north. "Your fire," she said, her voice low and a little rough.
"What about it?"
"It's burning." He looked at the hearth. The log had caught. He looked at his hand on the armrest. He removed it slowly, and the absence of his cool against her skin was, absurdly, the loudest thing in the room. "So it is," he said, and returned to his desk with the careful, measured steps of a man who was holding something fragile inside himself and could not afford to move quickly. Emma stared at her book for 20 minutes without reading a single word. Emma's role in the castle solidified, and she discovered something unexpected. She was useful. Not in the way Cassian had intended, not just as a living mute button for his psychic torment. She was useful because she could see things he couldn't. Cassian's gift, the one that tortured him, made him a receiver for every whisper of ambition, every flicker of deceit in his court. But the volume was so loud that the signal was lost in noise. He knew everyone was scheming. He couldn't always distinguish the schemes. Emma had spent her entire life reading rooms where no one noticed her. She'd had 20 years of practice watching pack dynamics from the outside, invisible, cataloging who deferred to who flinched when the alpha spoke, who smiled with their mouth but not their eyes. It was the only skill her invisibility had ever given her, and in a court of immortal predators playing thousand-year political games, it turned out to be devastatingly effective. Ashworth's faction is larger than you think, she told Cassian one morning over the maps table. It's not just the old families. He's been talking to Captain Drev. I've seen them in the South Corridor 3 times this week, and Drev doesn't go to the South Corridor for any reason I can find. Cassian looked up from his charts. His violet eyes were unreadable, but his hand, which had been turning a page, had gone very still. You noticed this. I notice things. It's what happens when no one notices you. You get very good at noticing them. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then, tell me more. She did. And for the first time in her life, the thing that had made her invisible made her indispensable. The true test came during the blood moon, when vampiric instincts ran high and the citadel thrummed with a dangerous, restless energy. Courtiers moved faster, sharper. Eyes burned brighter. The ancient hunger, usually managed with the cool discipline of centuries, pressed against its chains. Cassian summoned her to his private chambers, a stark, Spartan room with a large bed and a single window, the blood-red moon hanging outside like a wound in the sky. He was standing by the window, hands clenched at his sides, trembling. The calm her presence usually brought wasn't working. The psychic noise of an entire court losing its careful control was battering against his mind. You should not be here, he said, his voice a strained growl. It is not safe. You sent for me. A mistake. His shoulders hunched. The noise is louder tonight, and the thirst. He stopped. The word hung in the air between them. Emma assessed the situation with the clinical clarity she'd learned to deploy when everything inside her was screaming. He was dangerous. His eyes, when he turned, were no longer violet but a deep, burning red, and his fangs were slightly extended. He was the monster from the children's stories, fully manifest, fighting himself with every ounce of 1,000 years of will. The smart thing to do was leave, the survival thing. She sat down in the chair by his desk. What are you doing? He managed, the words ground out between clenched teeth. Sitting, in your chair. Which I have done every day for weeks. This is not new. This is different. You will not hurt me, she said. She was terrified. Her heart was a war drum, but she said it flat, factual, daring him to prove her wrong. You cannot know that. I know you, she said, and the words surprised her, because they were true. She knew the man who left books on her nightstand, who asked about the smell of rain, who had a 700-year grudge about a horse. She knew him, and the knowing was the most dangerous thing she'd ever done. He took a ragged step toward her. Another. He was shaking. The red in his eyes was a wildfire. And then Emma did the second bravest thing she'd ever done. The first was crawling to his gate. This one was harder. She stood, closed the distance between them, and shifted. The pain ripped through her. Bones, muscles, every cell rewriting itself in a white-hot blaze. She gasped into it, let it take her, and came out the other side on 4 legs, gray-furred and solid and very much alive, standing in a pile of shredded wool that had been a perfectly good dress. The wolf looked up at the vampire king with amber eyes. Cassian stared. The red was still in his eyes, but it had stopped advancing. His whole body was frozen, not with hunger, but with shock. A wolf. A living, breathing wolf, standing in his chambers, smelling of forest and earth and something warm and undeniably real. Every vampire instinct in him was screaming 2 contradictory things, prey and something else. Something he didn't have a word for. Emma sat down on his carpet, deliberately, and looked at him with an expression that, he would swear later, though wolves couldn't make human expressions, was profoundly unimpressed. I'm here. Calm down. The message wasn't telepathic, it was just obvious. He sank to his knees, slowly, as if his legs had simply decided they were finished. He knelt on the stone floor in front of a wolf and pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. And the sound that came from him was not a growl or a hiss, but a long, shuddering exhalation of a man releasing a pain he'd been holding for a very, very long time. The red faded from his eyes, his fangs retracted, his breathing slowed. Emma, still in wolf form, padded forward and pressed her flank against his side. He was cold, he was always cold, and she was furnace warm, her heartbeat a steady, living drum against his ribs. Emma, he whispered. It was the first time he'd used her name. She stayed pressed against him until the moon moved past the window and the worst of the night had passed. Then she shifted back, which was graceless and painful, and left her naked and shivering on his floor, wrapped in his black cloak before she could protest. His hands, careful, cold, shaking, settling the fabric around her shoulders without looking anywhere he shouldn't. You ruined your dress, he said quietly. I have others. You left 6 in my wardrobe. 5. There were 5. There are 6. Marin brought another one yesterday. Dark blue, my size. He said nothing. His jaw was tight. He was looking at the wall with tremendous concentration. Cassian, she said. He closed his eyes. Thank you for the book, she said, and the flower, and the 6th dress, and for not pretending you don't know what I'm talking about. The silence that followed was not the dead silence of the citadel. It was a living thing, warm with what neither of them was saying. You should go, he said, and his voice was rough. Before I do something unforgivable, like acknowledge that I care whether you're cold. Too late, she said, and left, wearing his cloak, which she did not return. After the blood moon, the pretense collapsed. And then, without warning, Cassian rebuilt it. He stopped summoning her. The first day, she assumed he was recovering. The psychic effort of the blood moon, of containing his own hunger, of being anchored by a wolf pressed against his side. It would take a toll. She spent the day in the library, reading, waiting for the door to open. It didn't. The second day, she went to his study. The door was closed. A guard she didn't recognize stood outside, not one of the usual pair who nodded at her passage, but a new one, blank-faced, who blocked her approach with a polite, immovable, "The king is not receiving visitors." Not receiving visitors. She was a visitor now. The third day, she saw him. He was crossing the far end of a corridor, moving with the quick, deliberate stride of a man who knew exactly where someone was and was choosing a route that avoided them. He did not look in her direction. He didn't need to. She could feel his awareness of her like a change in air pressure, and she could feel, with equal certainty, that he was walking away from it. On the 4th day, the fire in her chambers went out. No one came to relight it. The scent was the worst part. She'd been learning him for weeks. That winter air signature, clean and austere, threaded with the herbal astringency that was uniquely his. It had been growing stronger, clearer, as her wolf senses mapped him the way they'd once mapped Pack. And now it was gone. Not because he'd changed, but because he was no longer close enough for her to reach. The absence was physical, not metaphorical, not poetic. Physical. A frequency she'd tuned herself to had gone silent, and her body registered it the way it would register a missing limb, with a dull, persistent wrongness that no amount of logic could override. She understood what he was doing. She'd watched enough wolves do the same thing. The alpha who pulled away before a difficult decision, the mother who stopped touching a pup she knew she'd have to send to another pack. It was preemptive severance. He was cutting the connection before it could become something he couldn't survive losing. Because she was mortal. She would age. She would die. In the scope of his existence, she was already gone. The understanding didn't help. It made it worse, actually. Because understanding someone's reasons for hurting you didn't make the hurt smaller. It just made you hate them less while it happened. On the 5th day, Emma stopped waiting. She found him in the observatory, the crystal-domed chamber at the citadel's peak. He was standing at the great brass telescope, his back to the door, his cloak pooling around his feet like a shadow that had given up. The wind was a howl up here, the stars sharp and indifferent through the glass. "You're avoiding me," she said. He didn't turn. "I am managing a transition." "You're managing a retreat, there's a difference. I've done enough of both to know." "Emma, don't." The word came out harder than she intended. She took a breath. "Don't say my name in that voice, the one that sounds like you're already mourning me. I'm standing right here." He turned. The starlight carved his face into something stark and ancient, and his eyes were dark with a pain that had nothing to do with the psychic noise. This was personal. This was his. "You are mortal," he said, and the words fell like stones. "You will live, what, another 60 years, 70? And they will pass for me like a season. A brief, beautiful season. And then you will be gone. And I will still be here. And the silence you leave behind will be worse than the noise ever was. Do you understand? The noise was bearable because I had never known quiet. If I know quiet and lose it?" His voice fractured. He stopped, jaw clenched, and looked away. The wind screamed against the dome. Emma walked toward him. Her footsteps were loud on the stone floor. The only heartbeat in the room, the only warmth, the only thing in this dead, beautiful place that was running on borrowed time. She stopped in front of him, close enough to feel the cold pouring off his skin, close enough that the temperature difference between them was its own kind of intimacy. "So your solution," she said, her voice quiet and precise, "is to have the silence now, on your own terms, before it's taken from you." He said nothing. His jaw was iron. "You're pre-grieving me, Cassian. You're grieving someone who is alive and standing in front of you and furious with you. Do you know how that feels? To be mourned by someone who's looking right at you?" Her voice cracked, and she let it. "I have been invisible my entire life. I have been a void, a null, a ghost, a nothing. And now the one person who finally saw me is choosing to look away. And I need you to understand that that is the cruelest thing anyone has ever done to me. And I have a long list." His eyes snapped to hers. The pain in them was raw and immediate, and no longer carefully managed. "I am trying," he said, and his voice was ragged, "to protect you from what I am." "No, you're trying to protect yourself from what I make you feel. Those aren't the same thing, and you know it." The silence between them rang like a bell. He reached out. Not the careful, clinical hovering of their first meeting. This was instinct, unplanned, his cold hand closing around her wrist the way a drowning man grabs a rope. His thumb pressed against the pulse point, and she knew he could feel it, her heartbeat, fast and angry and alive, hammering against his cold fingers. 60 years, she said, looking up at him, is not nothing. It's not nothing to me. And if you spend those 60 years standing on the other side of a closed door because you're afraid of the 61st, then you're choosing the grief over the life. I know which one I'd choose. I've been choosing it since I crawled to your gate. His grip on her wrist tightened. His other hand came up, hovered at the side of her face. The old gesture, the clinical distance, and then broke past it. His palm settled against her jaw, cold fingers threading into her hair, and the touch was not careful. It was hungry and terrified, and it shook. "I don't know how to do this," he whispered. "Neither do I. I've never done any of this." "You are making it extraordinarily difficult to be noble about your mortality." "Good. Noble is just another word for lonely. You've had enough of that." He exhaled, a long, shuddering breath that she felt against her forehead, cold and real and close. His thumb traced the line of her jaw. Her skin burned under his touch, heat and cold meeting at the border, and she felt something in the air between them settle, lock, like a key finding its shape. She put her hand over his, the one on her wrist, warm over cold. The pulse between them was her heartbeat, singular and finite, and more valuable than either of them had ever given it credit for. "Stay," she said. Not a plea, an instruction. "Emma, stay. Not forever. I'm not asking for forever. I'm asking for now. I'm asking for the next morning and the one after that, and however many we get. That's what I'm worth. That's what you're worth. Don't you dare tell me it's not enough." The starlight poured through the crystal dome, cold and permanent, and the two of them stood in it, the ancient immortal king and the mortal wolf with the broken scent, and the distance between them was nothing. Not the careful 4 feet of the library, not the sealed doors and avoided corridors of the last 5 days. Nothing. "It is enough," he said. "You are enough." He leaned down and pressed his forehead to hers. The cold of his skin met the warmth of hers, and the temperature between them equalized into something that felt, impossibly, like coming home. They stood like that, forehead to forehead, for a long time. The kiss that came was not a dramatic thing. It was quiet, careful, the barest press of his cool mouth against hers. She tasted winter and stone and centuries of loneliness. And underneath all of it, something that was unmistakably, specifically him. He kissed her like a question. She kissed him back like an answer. When they pulled apart, his hand was still in her hair, and his eyes were open, and his expression was one she had never seen on any face, human or otherwise. It was the look of a man holding something precious, who had just decided, against every rational instinct, to keep it. "The fire in my chambers is out," she said, because she was who she was, and honesty would always come before poetry. "I know. I will have it relit." "You will have it relit right now." "I will have it relit right now." After that, the pretense collapsed for real. Kazian appeared at her door with a book he thought she'd like. He found her in the glass gardens and walked with her, his hand resting at the small of her back, in a gesture so natural she almost didn't notice the first time. Almost. He adjusted his schedule around hers without admitting it, and she stopped pretending she wasn't adjusting hers around his. The library sessions changed. The 4-foot distance between chairs shrank to 2, then to 1, then to a single shared settee by the fire, where she read with her feet tucked under her and his arm along the back of the cushion, not touching her, but close enough that the cold of his sleeve was a constant, deliberate presence against the warmth of her shoulder. Sometimes his fingers would drift from the cushion to the ends of her hair, absently, as if he wasn't aware he was doing it. He was aware. She was aware he was aware. Neither of them mentioned it, and the not mentioning became its own language. He kissed her once more, in the glass garden, beside the scentless silver roses. It was unhurried, deliberate, his hands bracketing her face, cold thumbs tracing her cheekbones, while her fingers curled into the front of his tunic and pulled him closer, because she was not a patient person, and she'd spent long enough being careful. He tasted like winter. She tasted, he told her later, like something he'd been remembering wrong for 900 years. And the court noticed. Lord Ashworth's faction, which Emma had been tracking for weeks, shifted from passive resentment to active hostility. The whispers sharpened. Enchantment, bewitched, unnatural influence. A mortal wolf had no place in a vampire king's private life. A mortal wolf who was changing the king's behavior was an existential threat. Ashworth made his first real move on a Tuesday. He brought a formal petition to court, requesting that all non-vampiric residents be confined to servant quarters and barred from the king's private wing, phrased in the careful, ancient legalese of someone who wanted to cage a specific person without naming her. Kassian dismissed it in 3 words. But Emma saw the look Ashworth exchanged with Captain Drev on his way out, and she saw the 4 other courtiers who held his gaze a beat too long, and she added all of it to her map. "There are 6 of them now," she told Kassian that evening. Ashworth, Drev, the 2 from the Eastern fiefdom, Lord Marin and his daughter, and 2 others I can't name yet, but they always sit together in the South Gallery. "You've been counting." Someone should. You can hear their thoughts, but you can't hear them over the noise. I can see their faces. Different skill, same information. He was quiet for a moment. Then, you are building me an intelligence network out of your own observations, while living as a guest in a castle full of creatures who would drain you without a second thought. When you say it like that, it sounds reckless. It sounds, he said, and his voice was strange, almost soft, like something no one has done for me in a very long time. They're afraid of you, Emma told Cassian one evening in the library. She was in her chair, his chair, she'd claimed it weeks ago. Her feet were tucked under her. She looked, she knew, completely at home, which was either a good sign or a catastrophic one. My court is always afraid. Fear is the engine of vampire politics. Not of you, of me. She looked at him steadily. They're afraid of what I'm doing to you. And what is that? Making you bearable? He looked at her. The corner of his mouth, the left side, always the left side, twitched. I was unbearable before? You were magnificent, which, in my experience, is just a fancier word for the same thing. Something warm and startled passed through his violet eyes, and he looked away quickly, which was how Emma knew she'd landed somewhere real. Ashworth will move against me eventually, she said, because the truth was always safer in her mouth than bottled up. You know that. He is welcome to try. That's very impressive and completely unhelpful. I need you to actually think about this. He looked at her again, and this time his expression was different. It was the face of a man who had not been told to think about something by another person in a very, very long time, and who had just realized how much he'd missed it. Very well, he said. I'm thinking about it. Good. Start with Captain Drev. The confrontation, when it came, was not from Ashworth. It came from the wolves. The Citadel's great warning bell, silent for over a century, split the air one afternoon with a deep, brazen clang that felt like a physical violation. Emma was in the library, tracing a river on a map she'd been studying for a tactical purpose she hadn't yet shared with Cassian, when the first toll shook through the stones. Guards materialized. Courtiers glided from their chambers. Marin appeared at the library door, her composure cracked by a single worried line between her brows. Petitioners, at the gate. Wolves. Emma's blood went cold. They brought her to the throne room, already full of vampires lining the walls in silent, menacing ranks. Cassian was on his throne, fully armored in his regal distance. His face was carved ice. His eyes found hers for one brief moment, a storm of fury and something that might have been fear, not for himself, but for her. The great doors opened. 3 figures marched in under heavy guard. Wolves. The one in the center was massive. Iron-gray hair, golden eyes burning with fierce authority, scars mapping his face. Garrett, alpha of the Moonridge Pack. The man who had looked at her with weary disgust and let her go, the way you let a broken thing fall from your hand. His gaze swept the room, dismissive of every vampire present, until it found her. So, he said, his voice a gravelly boom, the little ghost found a new master. You are a long way from your woods, Cassian said, dangerously soft. Why should I hear you? We've come to collect what is ours. She's of our pack, a stray. Her presence here is an insult. Lord Ashworth stepped forward with smooth, practiced timing. The creature begged for sanctuary. She belongs to the crown now. I belong to no one, Emma said. Every eye turned to her. The silence was absolute. She felt the weight of it. Centuries of protocol, of women who did not speak in throne rooms, of wolves who did not challenge alphas. She felt it, and she spoke through it. She stepped forward, out from behind the throne, out from behind Cassian's shadow, and stood where everyone could see her. You didn't come to collect me, Garrett, she said, her voice carrying in the stillness with a clarity that surprised even her. You came to clean up a loose end. You let me go because I was nothing to you. I was less than nothing. I was an embarrassment. And now I'm an embarrassment that ended up somewhere inconvenient, And you want to fix that. Garrett's eyes narrowed. A growl built in his chest. Don't, she said, and the word was a blade. I've listened to that growl my whole life. It doesn't work on me anymore. You know why? Because the worst thing you could ever do to me, you already did. You let me believe I was broken. You let the whole pack believe it. And when I ran, no one even noticed. She turned to Kazian. His violet eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that was almost physical. I'm speaking for myself, she said to him. Quiet, clear. He inclined his head. 1 degree. Permission and acknowledgement wrapped in the smallest possible gesture. She turned back to Garrett. I'm not going with you. I'm not your stray. I'm not his property. She gestured toward Kazian without looking at him. I'm standing here because I choose to. That's new for me. I'd like to keep doing it. Garrett snarled. You have no standing to choose. You're an omega, a null. You are enough. Kazian's voice was quiet, but it filled the hall the way thunder fills a valley. He rose from the throne, and it was a movement that made every instinct in the room, vampire and wolf, flinch. She has spoken for herself, he said, descending the steps. Her words stand. She is here by her own choice. That choice is under my protection, and yours. He looked at Garrett with eyes that had gone very, very cold. Is to leave. Garrett bristled, his body beginning to tremble with the first signs of a shift. You'd risk war for a broken... He didn't finish the sentence. Emma shifted. The change ripped through her with a violence that cracked the air. One moment she was a woman in a green dress. The next, she was a wolf. Gray, lean, coiled with a savage energy that had been building for 20 years of silence. The dress fell in shreds. She stood between Kazian and the wolves, hackles raised, teeth bared, and the snarl that tore from her throat was the sound of every night she'd spent invisible, every name she'd swallowed, every time she'd been too broken to matter. It was not a powerful snarl. She was not a large wolf, but it was specific, and it was fearless, and it stopped Garrett mid-shift. Kazian looked down at the wolf standing in front of him. Protecting him, he realized, not the other way around. And something in his ancient, careful heart cracked open so suddenly it was visible on his face. The mask didn't slide. It shattered. For one unguarded moment, every courtier in the room saw their king look at a wolf with an expression that had no name in their language because they had forgotten what it looked like. Then the moment passed, the mask rebuilt. But the damage was done. Kazian unleashed his power, not at Emma's wolves, at the room's certainty. A wave of psychic force pressed outward. The torches flickered. The air went cold. Garrett's lieutenants staggered, hands to their heads. Garrett himself dropped to a knee, blood weeping from his nose. Leave, Kazian said, and his voice was the sound of stone doors closing. She is not yours. She is not mine. She is hers. And you will not touch what is hers while I stand. Garrett, trembling with effort and agony, forced himself upright. He looked at Emma, the wolf, the null, the nothing, standing in front of a vampire king with her teeth bared, and something shifted in his expression. Not understanding, but the beginning of a question he'd never thought to ask. He turned. This isn't over. It is, Kazian said softly. The doors closed. The psychic pressure vanished. Kazian swayed, ashen, a hand to his temple. Emma shifted back, graceless, gasping, shivering, and Marin was there instantly with a cloak, wrapping her before the court could gawk. Emma stood, wrapped in wool, barefoot on the cold obsidian, and put her hand on Kazian's arm. He leaned into it. You said I was hers, she murmured, too quiet for anyone else to hear. I said what was true. You broke, in front of everyone. Your face. I know. His voice was rough. I know what they saw. Was it true? He looked down at her. The weariness was back, heavier than ever, but underneath it was something that had not been there before. A warmth, a choosing. Every word, he said. Every expression they saw. All of it. She held his gaze. Her heart was hammering, her body still shaking from the shift, and she was standing in the center of a vampire court wearing a borrowed cloak and nothing else, which was, she reflected with the grim, precise humor that had kept her alive this long, not the most dignified way to have the most important conversation of her life. "Then we should probably talk about it," she said. "In private. After I find pants." The left corner of his mouth curved. "That seems wise." He took her to the library. Marin brought clothes. Emma changed behind a screen while Cassian stood by the fire, and neither of them pretended the silence between them was comfortable. When she emerged, dressed, composed, still trembling faintly, she found him sitting. Not standing, not looming, not performing authority. Sitting in a chair by the fire, his elbows on his knees, his head in his hands. His fingers were laced through his dark hair and his knuckles were white, and it was the most human she had ever seen him. He looked up when he heard her. The violet of his eyes was deep and bruised, and the skin beneath them was shadowed in a way she'd never noticed before. The psychic assault he'd unleashed on Garrett had cost him badly. His hands, when he lowered them, were shaking. "I owe you the truth," he said. "You owe me several truths. I've been keeping a list." "I hear everything." He said it simply, as if describing a chronic condition. Every vampire in this citadel, their thoughts, their hungers, their schemes. A constant screaming chorus that has not stopped in 1,000 years. When you are near, the chorus fades. You are quiet. A space of silence in the center of the storm. "So I'm your mute button." "You were." He looked at his own hands. They were still trembling, and he watched them as if they belonged to someone else. "When you arrived, yes. That is what I saw in you. A solution. A tool." He paused, and the pause had weight. "I am telling you this because you use honesty as armor, and I think you deserve to know what it feels like to have it returned." She sat down across from him. Her throat was tight. She could smell him, that winter air signature, but altered now, threaded with something sharp and metallic she hadn't encountered before. Exhaustion, she realized. Or pain. Her wolf senses were reading him, the way they'd once read pack members. And the information was arriving whether she wanted it or not. He is hurt. He is depleted. He is not safe to be alone. She stayed. "You were a void to me," he continued. "And then you were a voice. You told me about summer rain and autumn leaves and the texture of moss. You counted my correspondence and tracked my enemies and sat in my chair with your feet tucked under you and told me I was magnificent in a tone that made it sound like a character flaw. It is a character flaw. Perhaps." His half smile, but it faltered. The mask was trying to reassemble and failing. She watched it happen, watched him reach for the regal distance that had protected him for 1,000 years and find it wasn't there. His hands clenched on his knees. "But you also stood in front of me tonight," he said, and his voice changed, dropped into something raw and unsteady, nothing like the polished baritone of the throne room. "In wolf form, protecting me from your own kind. No one has stood in front of me in 1,000 years, Emma. No one has considered that I might need it." "You looked at me," she said, and her voice cracked just slightly at the seam. "In the throne room, when I shifted, everyone saw your face." "Yes." "What was that?" He didn't answer immediately. He stood, turned to the fire, and braced one hand on the mantelpiece. The trembling in his fingers was worse. He gripped the stone until the shaking stopped, and the effort of that, of controlling the one thing he could still control, was visible in every line of his body. "I have not," he said to the fire, "felt anything unplanned in centuries. Every response I have is curated. Every expression is a calculation. I have had to be this way, because the alternative, feeling openly, reacting without control, would mean drowning in the noise. Do you understand? I am not cold because I choose to be. I am cold because warmth would destroy me." He turned. His eyes were bright and too open, and they looked, for the first time, afraid. "And then you shifted, and you stood there, this small, gray, furious wolf, baring her teeth at the creatures who had raised her, and I felt—" He stopped. His jaw worked. He tried again. "I felt something I had not prepared a response for. I had no mask for it. The court saw because there was nothing to see through. For the first time in 1,000 years, my face showed exactly what was happening inside me, and I could not stop it." The fire crackled. Emma's chest ached with a pressure that had nothing to do with breathing. "What was happening inside you?" she asked, barely above a whisper. He crossed the room, not with the predatory grace she was used to. He moved like a man who had forgotten to be careful. He stopped in front of her chair and knelt, slowly, deliberately. A king on his knees for the second time that night, and this time there was no blood moon to blame. He took her hand. His fingers were cool, hers warm. The contact sent a shock through both of them, and neither pulled away. "It was the moment I understood," he said, looking up at her, "that you are not my silence. You are the only thing I have wanted to hear in 1,000 years." Her breath caught. She felt the sting behind her eyes, and she let it come, because if he was going to kneel on a stone floor and say something that honest, the least she could do was not hide behind her own armor. "That's—" her voice broke. She tried again. "That's better than the mute button thing." He laughed. It was soft, startled, rusty, a sound that had not been used in a very long time, pulled out of him against his will. It changed his whole face. The weariness was still there, but for the first time it wasn't the only thing. "I have lived for 1,000 years, he said, "and in that time I have accumulated power, knowledge, territory, and a court full of creatures who fear me exactly the right amount. I have not, in all that time, had a single person look at me and say, 'Calm down,' with the sheer force of will you brought to that blood moon night. I have not had someone steal my cloak and refuse to return it. I have not had someone tell me to think about something in a tone that suggested I hadn't been. You are the first new thing that has happened to me in centuries, and I find that I am—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "Terrified," she finished for him. "Yes." "Good. That makes 2 of us." She squeezed his hand. He squeezed back, and neither of them let go. He was still kneeling, and she could smell him clearly now. Winter air, old paper, that new sharp note of exhaustion. And underneath it all, something she hadn't noticed until this exact moment. A warmth. Faint, barely there. Like the first thaw at the end of a long winter. So subtle you'd miss it if you weren't paying attention. But she was always paying attention. And what her wolf senses were telling her, with the quiet certainty of something that had already decided, was that this was hers. He was hers. Not in the possessive, territorial way of pack bonds. Something different. Something that had been built out of library hours and stolen cloaks and the 6-year-old story she'd told him, like it was nothing, because she'd learned to make everything nothing. He had heard it, and he had not let it be nothing. That was the bond. Not a bite, not a mark. Just a man who refused to let the truth about her be small. "I'm not your sanctuary anymore," she said. "And you're not mine. I don't need one. I need a place to stand, and a person who lets me stand there." "You have both," he said, "for as long as you want them." She looked at him, the beautiful, ancient, impossible creature who had saved her life. For selfish reasons, and then, without planning to, without wanting to, had begun to care about her for real ones. Who left flowers in books and counted the dresses in her wardrobe, and laughed like a man remembering how. "I want them," she said. "I'm choosing this. I need you to hear that, because nobody has ever asked me to choose before, and I'd like the first time to count." He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles. His mouth was cool. The gesture was old-fashioned, deliberate, and absolutely sincere. And when he lowered her hand, he didn't let go. He stayed there, on his knees, holding her hand like something he'd been given that he didn't quite trust himself to keep. "It counts," he said. She reached out with her free hand and touched his face. His cheek was cool under her fingers, smooth as stone, and she felt the faintest tremor run through him. Not from cold, not from hunger. From the simple, devastating fact of being touched gently by someone who meant it. "It counts," she repeated, quieter. He turned his face into her palm, pressing his mouth against the center of it. Not a kiss, not quite. Something more private than that. Something that belonged to the specific language they'd been building, in libraries and observatories and beside fires he couldn't feel. His lips were cool against the heat of her skin, and his breath was a shudder that she felt all the way down her arm. Then he straightened, still on his knees, and looked at her with eyes that had stopped pretending to be ancient and regal and controlled. They were just his eyes. Violet, tired, wanting. She leaned forward and kissed him. Not the observatory's careful first kiss, not the garden's unhurried second. This one was the third, and the third was the one that meant they weren't going back. She kissed him with her hands on his jaw and his cold skin warming under her fingers, and the taste of winter and confession on his mouth. He kissed her back with one hand in her hair and the other pressing against her ribs, over her heart, as if he needed to feel it beating while he still could. They broke apart breathing hard, her breathing hard, his breathing at all, which was itself a concession his body only made for her. "The cloak," he said, his voice rough. "You still have it. I told you I wasn't giving it back. I know, I had another one made. The original is yours. That's the most romantic thing you've ever said to me, and you once compared me to the sound of the world he'd been remembering wrong for 900 years. That was objectively more romantic." It was, but the cloak is more you. He smiled, a real one. Both sides of his mouth, the lines at the corners of his eyes, the whole architecture of his face rearranging into something that was, she realized, what he must have looked like before 1,000 years of solitude taught him to stop. They stayed like that for a long time, in the blue light of the fire, her hands on his face, his on her heart, and the silence between them was not the dead silence of the citadel, or the hollow silence of her missing scent. It was the kind of silence that only exists between two people who have said the hardest things and are resting in the warm, stunned aftermath. Outside, the wind howled against the citadel stones. Inside, two people who had been alone for a very long time held on to each other and did not pretend it was anything less than what it was. Emma would stay. Not as a ghost, not as a tool, not as a void. As the woman who saw what no one else could see, who spoke the truth before it could be used against her, and who had walked into the house of the dead and found, against every reasonable expectation, something alive. And Kazian would keep the cloak on her chair. Just in case.